In 2 weeks, it's happening. Lubbock's power grid's about to change. If you have questions, KLBK News has the details you need to know before the big switch. Now your hosts, KLBK's Terry Furman and Matt Stell.
Coming up, we are less than 2 weeks from the big switch. So what does that mean for your bills, and when can you expect lights out at your house?
Plus, the massive failure of the ERCOT grid back in February. A look at the much-needed changes state officials have made so far.
But first, find out why Lubbock is switching to ERCOT in the first place. Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us here for the Big Switch to ERCOT special. I'm Terry Furman.
And I'm Matt Stell. If you're a Lubbock Power and Light customer, you got to listen up. For the next 30 minutes, we'll go over all that you need to know and can expect about the big switch to the ERCOT grid.
As we get closer to Memorial Day weekend, many of you might be wondering why this big switch to ERCOT is even happening as we move from the Southwest Power Pool over to the state's main grid.
KLBK's Grace Morris joins us now. Grace, how did this whole switch come about in the first place?
Terry and Matt, to get the full story, you actually have to go back around 17 years. You see, right now, LPNL buys all its power from XL Energy, which is connected to the Southwest Power Pool. But in 2004, that was the last time LPNL signed a contract with XL, which is set to expire in 2019. And in those 15 years, LPNL began to take a look to see if staying in the Southwest Power Pool was the best thing for Lubbock. At the very core of this switch was one big decision, whether or not to build a power plant in Lubbock. That was the requirement in order for Lubbock to stay with the Southwest Power Pool.
And so the leadership, over about 10 years, took a look at different variations of building power plants for Lubbock.
But building a power plant could have cost around $750 million, meaning there would have been rate increases for the next 30 to 40 years. But 10 years after LPNL signed a contract with XL Energy to buy all wholesale power from them, a new administration took over LPNL. It was then that they decided to change their approach to the power plant question and see what other solutions there were for Lubbock.
Instead of saying, let's put a request for proposal or RFP out on the street saying, give us an option of how to build a power plant. Instead, we took a broader approach to it and said, give us solutions on how you can provide us with X amount of megawatts.
But while it wasn't originally a solution, ERCOT became a possible answer because of improvements made to their grid.
In the 10 years prior to 2014, about $6.5 billion worth of transmission lines had been built right up to our neighborhood in order to capture the renewable energy and take it back down to the Metroplex.
But ultimately, the decision came down to what would be better for LPNL customers.
And what was found over and over and over again is that the solutions in ERCOT were far more attractive than those in the Southwest Power Pool.
It was a new discussion for everyone in the room. There were conversations about what infrastructure had been planned for the city of Lubbock. There were conversations about what new infrastructure would be needed to connect the city of Lubbock customers.
In order to switch, LPNL built 150 miles of new transmission lines to connect to the existing ERCOT lines. And to improve our system, they upgraded their substations and installed smart meters across town. The new access to ERCOT will also allow for diversification of energy supply.
There's going to be additional transmission lines that connect them to the ERCOT region, so they're going to have a more reliable connection as well. In addition, there's a lot of wind generation up in the Panhandle, and those facilities as well are going to have an improved connection into the ERCOT system.
But as far as the switch goes,
they should expect to see no difference at all, completely behind the scenes.
That the way that you receive power in your everyday life is not going to change. You should not be able to recognize the difference.
Remember, this switch next week only affects 70% of LPNL customers right now. And according to LPNL, the switch could also allow competition between power companies to return to Lubbock, but only once 100% of the grid is switched over.
Thank you, Grace. So what is this ERCOT grid? No, it's not the Disney World attraction you might be thinking of. That's ERCOT. And while it's had a few different names, it's a very unique system that's been part of the Lone Star State for quite some time now, for over 50 years. With all this talk about ERCOT, how does it actually work? The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, manages the flow of electric power to over 26 million Texans. That's 90% of the state's electric load. It's similar to air traffic control we see at the airport. It doesn't own the planes or runways, but it makes sure everything runs smoothly 24 hours a day. ERCOT doesn't make electricity, but it is responsible for the grid that connects more than 46,000 miles of transmission lines from various power plants to our homes. On top of that, ERCOT has to keep the electric market competitive so that customers have plenty of options when it comes to picking their electric provider and that the monthly rates they pay are fair. But this type of system has to have some sort of oversight. So the folks in charge of ERCOT answer to the state's Public Utility Commission, a 3-person board appointed by the governor.
Now, we heard just how ERCOT works, but where does the energy come from? In 2020, 45.5% of ERCOT's energy use came from natural gas, and a little more than 22% was from wind power, and just 17.9% was from coal. It's projected for 2021 that 51% of energy for the year will come from natural gas in the state, and 24.8% will be from wind. There are more than 24,000 megawatts of installed wind capacity across the state of Texas.
And Terry, many of that here in the Panhandle and across the South Plains. Back in February, a lot of folks questioned the role of that wind power during the devastating winter storm we all witnessed. But reports later show that the loss of those frozen windmills only played a small part of the massive failure. Not having enough natural gas was the bigger issue.
Yeah, it's been 3 months now since the storm that left more than 2/3 of Texans in the dark, which could end up costing the state hundreds of billions of dollars. KLBK's Alyssa Tejas takes us back to that week.
Winter Storm Yuri, a large snowstorm that made an impact from coast to coast, bringing snowfall, ice, and the coldest temperatures the state hadn't seen in decades.
It was -2 degrees last night.
And as the temperatures continued to fall, Texas energy use rose. By early February 15th, ERCOT began calling for rolling blackouts, meant to last for 45 minutes. But for some, those rolling outages to try and conserve energy lasted for days.
I couldn't melt snow in my apartment because it was 34 degrees.
How long is this going to last? It was very stressful.
According to a study from the University of Houston, 69% of Texans lost power between February 14th and February 20th for an average of 42 hours.
I just want it back on. Spent the night pretty much in the cold, which is something I've never done. With a 2-year-old, it was dreadful.
At a time when essential services were needed the most, the system broke.
Lubbock didn't go without its problems. LPNL was forced to manually cut power to some customers, but only briefly.
Well, nobody wants to get to that point, but that's where you find yourself when you have a storm of this nature.
For Reverend Michael White, he says Pilgrim Baptist Church began to flood as a result of the outages.
We didn't account for rolling blackouts. And so at some point, the HVAC system went off.
Now left to make repairs, he's thankful for the community support, but is wary for what's to come once Lubbock makes the switch.
I think if you don't address it, you'll wind up here again.
Alyssa Tejas, KLBK News.
Ahead of the big switch, we asked our state leaders if the system can handle more homes. KLBK's Wes Rappaport spoke to ERCOT officials and Texas lawmakers on whether the grid is ready.
Inside the ERCOT control room, the team prepares to add thousands of new customers from Lubbock, with the plan nearly a decade in the making finally coming to fruition.
There's an enormous amount of engineering work underway. There are new transmission lines that have been constructed in order to reliably serve the citizens of the city of Lubbock that are moving over into the ERCOT region.
ERCOT's Senior Director of System Planning says the new deal will also bring more generation power from the South Plains and the Panhandle, now painting a rosy picture after the February fiasco.
The new transmission assets are going to be increasing reliability, not just in the region, but also increasing reliability throughout the grid. I don't think there are any specific concerns at all.
Some lawmakers see it the same way. State Rep John Frullo says he's hopeful Lubbock customers won't see a real change.
When we turn that light switch on, we want power, and we want to be able to afford that bill.
At the federal level, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg told me the infrastructure failures showed a need for reform.
We need to recognize that our power infrastructure is critical infrastructure and needs to have real, serious, major federal investment.
Lubbock's state senator, Republican Charles Perry, tells me legislative proposals this session to reform the grid in light of the February freeze will bring reliability back to the Electric Reliability Council of Texas.
We will have done the things regulatory-wise that will hopefully open up the opportunities to do what needs to be done to not guarantee, but minimize the disruptions going forward.
I also contacted the remaining member of the Lubbock delegation. That's Representative Dustin Burrows. He was not available to talk to us for this report. At the Texas Capitol, I'm Wes Rappaport, KLBK News.
ERCOT says the winter storm had little to no effect on planning for this transition, but they are still working on regaining the public's trust after that near grid collapse. We're told that they're addressing how the council is structured, and they plan to communicate better with Texans about what's happening with the grid.
We've all been talking about the big switch, and you've heard a lot about it this evening. Joining me now, Matt Rose, with the LPNL spokesperson. Matt, there's a lot of questions on people's minds that they really want answers to. So, first off, are we expecting outages as we switch?
Yes, as we make that migration to the Texas grid, there will be a temporary outage, and we're working right now to notify those affected customers and let them know a little bit more about what they can expect over that weekend.
A lot of people, a lot of customers that I've talked to are very concerned about, okay, ERCOT, the grid itself, couldn't deal with the amount of people they had on the grid in February. We're looking at high heat this summer.
Right.
Are they going to be able to sustain us as well? And would we be the first to be, considered in rolling blackouts?
Well, first off, when you look at ERCOT as a whole, the capacity on the ERCOT grid is right about 82,000 megawatts. Our peak here in Lubbock over the summer months comes to about 650 megawatts. So we're about 0.5% of the size of ERCOT. And so coming into the summer, they're still forecasting about 15% reserve, which is double what they had this time last year. You just have to remember that we sought out the ERCOT market because it's a more efficient system and produces substantial cost savings for our customers. So that's just kind of one of many factors that we looked at back in 2014 when this process began. Because at that point we had two paths in front of us. One of them was to build transmission lines where the debt would be completely paid for by the ERCOT system. And the other was to build a large power plant that would have been about $750 million that our ratepayers alone would have paid for. And so when you just look at the flexibility and the diversity in ERCOT, you look at the cutting some of those fixed costs that are tens of millions of dollars a year, you look at the fact that once we get 100% of our customers over the line and into the ERCOT market, we can then proceed forward at looking at opting into retail competition.
Last question is this. We're not going to practice for this big switchover, like it's just going to happen. What is the biggest concern LPNL has about that day? What if something big comes up? What are the contingency plans?
The biggest concern we have are external factors causing this to be delayed. We've done engineering study after engineering study. We've got inside engineers, we've got outside consultants. A lot of work has gone into this. The system's mapped, and we feel like this is going to make good progress and be an efficient system. But if we get to a particular substation where we get hung up, that could delay. And so we're walking through contingencies of if we have a delay at a certain substation, how do we manage that and kind of leapfrog it, continue working and staying on schedule, but still working on that one substation. So it's a very complex thing. It's not like you can necessarily make a dry run, but as close to it as we can, we've been trying to. Because you're certainly not going to have a test case where you outage some folks just to see if it works, but we're trying every way we can to run models and test the system to make sure it's all ready.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much for spending the time.
Sure.
Going over a lot of these questions. We certainly appreciate it, as many people are concerned about the big switch. Now, for more information to see the full interview, you can go to the Big Switch on our website, everythinglubbock.com, big banner. Click on that. You can see the full interview.
More to come here on The Big Switch. How will the move to ERCOT affect our bills? Will they go up, or will we have more options? Plus, what should you expect during the Memorial Day blackouts? We answer those questions right after the break.
In 2 weeks, it's happening. Lubbock's power grid's about to change. If you have questions, KLBK News has the details you need to know before the big switch. Now your hosts, KLBK's Terry Furman and Matt Stell.
Welcome back to The Big Switch. With Lubbock joining the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or better known as ERCOT, what other parts of the state are already in the grid?
Yeah, since ERCOT encompasses 75% of the land area in Texas, it includes some of the state's large urban populations, including Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. ERCOT also extends across most of West Texas, the Panhandle, and the Rio Grande Valley. And as you've heard, holds 90% of the Texas load.
Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are also working to help both Texans and the power grid prepare for the next winter storm, which could happen at any point in time. KLBK's Anna Warnick is in Washington with more on this effort.
Matt and Terry, as the state legislature considers their own bills to weatherize the Texas power grid, Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn says something needs to be done at the federal level to strengthen the grid. Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn introduced the Power On Act to keep the lights on during the next storm.
To provide grants to states to help weatherize their grid, and it would apply to any state who needs that help.
The bill would authorize $500 million in federal grant money to help power providers, distributors, and suppliers winterize existing electric equipment.
Our electricity grid's part of our critical infrastructure in America, and we need to have that up and running.
The bill already has bipartisan support. Cornyn teamed up with Texans in the House, including Democrat Eddie Bernice Johnson and Republicans Kevin Brady and Michael Burgess. Under their bill, the Department of Energy would be tasked with coming up with recommendations for each state and then provide targeted grants. States would also be expected to match the money.
We have to make sure that we have winterization plans and that we have safeguards in place for those 50-year, 100-year storms.
Texas Republican Congressman Jody Arrington says because of all the attention at both the state and federal level, he's not concerned for Lubbock to join the rest of the state's power grid.
A lot of retooling has happened. I think there's a lot of lessons learned, and it is a much stronger utility system and a much more resilient grid.
Senator Cornyn says this is just the first step. He says it's going to take some time to completely weatherize the Texas power grid, but he says after February's winter storm, it's clear that it's important to start that process now. In Washington, I'm Anna Warnick, KLBK News.
Lubbock Mayor Dan Pope joining us now. Mayor, thank you so much for being here. Of course, the big switch. Yeah. That's been the topic these past couple of months, switching to ERCOT. And starting off, let's get to the gist of it. Why is the city switching to the ERCOT grid?
I think the reasons behind it, Matt, were we'd like to get back to competition. I think that's Lubbock citizens had competition for more than 90 years. It was an either or. The ERCOT market has more competition, but I think that's one reason. I think the affordability of power. I think we'll find that ERCOT will offer our residents options that are less expensive than what they're paying today. And we believe long term that there'll be reliability there too. We don't want to gloss over that fact, the big failure they had this year. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that. But those are the main reasons, and we're supportive of the effort. It's not perfect, but few things in life are, and I believe long term this is the right path for Lubbock.
We talked about why the city is doing it. February, yeah, that was a big deal. We saw that winter storm. We saw the failures of the ERCOT grid, but even then, the city is still making the big switch. Reasons why? Any reasons why the city has not delayed that switch?
Well, a couple. That's a really good question. And so. A couple of reasons. First of all, we don't have an energy contract after the end of this month, at which point we'll join ERCOT. Maybe as importantly is we've made literally hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in building transmission to connect us to ERCOT. So we are invested. Now, we will be paid back for those transmission lines as other parts of the state use that transmission to get power from the Panhandle to not only Lubbock but other parts of the state. But those are the big reasons why you can't just pause.
I guess I imagine your concerns are probably the same as mayor and as a resident, but what are some of your concerns if you have any?
Well, I think first of all, before a concern, I think it's important that we remember that the ERCOT grid serves 26 million out of 29 million Texans. It supports the 9th largest economy in the world. It's got to be stable. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be affordable. So the concerns I have would be like anyone else would have. I do think that although as bad as what happened in February was, the timing might have been very good for Lubbock, because I think we will join a grid that will be getting some needed upgrades, specifically around reliability.
Talk about why the switch and moving to the ERCOT grid is so important for the Lubbock power infrastructure.
Well, I think long term, as we talked about, it provides choice. I think it provides more affordability. People that want to buy green power. I mean, you know, once we get to where we can opt into choice, a citizen might choose to pay more for their power during the day when they're not home and less for power at night, much like people in the Metroplex can today. I think for our industrial users, it gives them the chance to be in a much more competitive marketplace. I think long term, the reliability is important in there too. But I think there are a number of reasons, Matt, that make sense for our ratepayers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
The big day, Memorial Day weekend, is when the big switch to ERCOT will take place, which means around 83,000 customers can expect a brief outage when LPNL unplugs from the Southwest Power Pool and into the ERCOT grid. But how can you find out if and when you'll be affected by the change? KLBK's Olivia Whitehead has what you need as we prepare for the big switch in less than 2 weeks.
We're going to start on the northeast side of the city, and we're going to work substation by substation making this conversion.
Which means a different group of customers will be affected each time.
So these two electrical grids that we have currently are separate, but they're completely spiderweb.
Which raises the question of how customers will know if and when they'll be affected.
So we created a tool that's on LPNL.com. They will plug in their meter number.
But before you head outside to locate that number, take a look at the LPNL section of your bill. That E- followed by 8 digits is what you will then need to input into that tool.
And then it will tell you whether you're going to be affected on Saturday or Sunday and give you a 4-hour time window of when your 30-minute outage is going to take place.
A 4-hour window causing some concerns for those businesses that will be affected.
Like my particular window, I was able to look it up on the LPNL site, and it's like from 12:30 to 4:30. By health codes, we're not allowed to be open if we don't have electricity. So if we don't know exactly that half hour we're supposed to be closed, I don't know how we're supposed to operate.
LPNL understands these circumstances are not ideal, but is necessary at this time.
We will work as hard as we can to try to make this as efficient, as quick as possible, and then folks can get on with their lives, and we won't impact them more than necessary.
Olivia Whitehead, KLBK News.
A big question for a lot of you all out here is, what is this going to do to our power bills?
Yeah, LPNL tells us that Lubbock ratepayers won't see the full savings of the move until 5 years from now. That's because LPNL has to pay $22 million each year for the first 5 years, which will get credited to the customers to alleviate the cost of the integration. But LPNL tells us that making the switch will produce substantial cost savings for the customer over time.
There's a payment that our customers make that goes as basically a subsidy or an additional payment to people that build power plants in the Southwest Power Pool. The problem is that because of the rules in the Southwest Power Pool, our folks can't access any of that power. Where in ERCOT, you can buy from anybody in the market, and they don't have that subsidy charge. And so that comes to about $40 million a year that our customers will no longer be paying as we enter the market.
Sit down. If a customer is using 500 kilowatts per hour, they'll see about an 8% savings, and the savings go up. If a customer uses 2,000 kilowatts per hour, they can expect to save about 9%.
I hope you guys have got some really good information tonight on the big switch. For everything you've seen here tonight and more, you can head to our website, everythinglubbock.com, and click the big switch banner.
For sure. For news anytime, follow us on social media. We'll see you back here tonight at 10.